Top Med Talk.
Well, hello and welcome to EBPOM Ireland, day one. We are here with Top Med Talk, having our conversations in person, which is absolutely crazy. I'm so excited. I'm Desiree Chappell, your host of Top Med Talk. I'm a CRNA from Kentucky, and I'm the Vice President of Clinical Quality for North Star Anesthesia, and I'm Managing Editor for Top Med Talk. And I'm joined by my co-host, Editor-in-Chief of Top Med Talk, and Professor of Anesthesia and Critical Care at University College London, Monty. It is wonderful to see you in person.
It's good to be here with you, Desiree. Now sometimes we do these things as pre-records and we're implying the fact that we're in a particular place, but we are actually right at the moment in the Skellig Hotel on the west coast of Ireland. I've had to go to another room. I'm looking out across the bay at the moment. The weather's not entirely perfect right at the moment as it was yesterday. So there we go. So, well, Desiree, it's great to have you here in Ireland.
Well, it's wonderful to be here. And Monty, it just feels so good to actually sit down and have a conversation with you. I know we've already started to record a little bit, and though we have been participating in Zoom for the last 18 months, there's nothing like having an in-person conversation. Now, that being said, our guest that we have today is actually joining us by Zoom, which is fine. But we do guarantee that we will have a conversation if COVID doesn't interfere this next time at Anesthesiology 2021. And we'll talk about that here in just a minute. But I want to introduce our next guest. We have Rick Dutton, who is actually a friend of EBPOM and has been on Top Med Talk before. He's the Chief Quality Officer for US Anesthesia Partners out of Texas. Rick, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Desiree. Thank you, Monty. Always a pleasure.
Rick, my favorite conversation with you was at EBPOM Dallas. Well, I guess it was 2019. And Monty was interviewing you and said he just wanted to find out Rick, the man, the legend. You're like, the man. And you shared some of your great stories. It was a really good conversation.
Rick, we won't go over it again now because we've got it there recorded for people to listen to. But when you're about halfway through, there was that kind of, wow, I see why you're interviewing this guy now, because we didn't expect all of that.
Because you've done a lot more than just the quality chief quality officer. Yeah,
I'm on my, I guess, third career at this point, maybe fourth if you count video game designer, but we won't go into that. And I have not climbed Mount Everest. But I started as an anesthesiologist at the Shock Trauma Center in Baltimore, the biggest trauma center in the U.S. And my first career was as an academic in trauma anesthesia. And I still do that. I'm the trauma editor for anesthesia and analgesia, and I still participate in the trauma world. But I did that for about 20 years. I was a professor at the University of Maryland, and I did all the academic things. In 2009, I went to work for the American Society of Anesthesiologists. I eventually was their first chief quality officer. But the task there was to set up our National Anesthesia Registry, NACOR, which I did. We got it off the ground. It turned into a bureaucratic colossus, and it was time to move on. And so in 2015, I joined US Anesthesia Partners, the largest single specialty group in the US. So it's a very large private practice, and I won't get into the details about how USAP is organized, but my job is to bring quality. We want to be the best anesthesia group in the country, and it's my job to prove that we are. So unlike the ASA job where I could see everything but do nothing, in this job, I'm closer to the levers, and I can actually implement what we need to do to improve the quality of our care. So that's where I am today.
And you've really impacted a lot here, definitely in the U.S. for anesthesia and in that role of quality through the ASA. Rick, tell us a little bit about what you do there at USAP when it comes to quality. I know you guys have formed a quality team there and you have a process.
Right. I chair a national, it's called the Clinical Quality Committee internally. It's a construct of our board of directors. So we report directly to the top of the organization. And it's doctors and quality professionals from all of our groups around the country. So it's about, right now, it's 30 to 35 doctors. We don't really vote on things, so anybody is welcome to join as long as they're motivated. And I keep everybody on the list who's participating, basically. And as I say, it includes our risk and quality directors in all of our large groups around the country, so every city where USAP is. And it's a wonderful forum for talking through what we need to do. and there's some blocking and tackling parts of it, so English football or American football, but the basic things we have to do, the infrastructure for gathering data, what we're going to measure, how we're going to report to the feds, internal scorecards, that kind of stuff. And we manage all of that. But more fun, much more fun, is to be the sounding board for USAP for clinical innovation. So the way I phrase that is my job is identifying best practices and moving them around. And I probably don't see as many as you guys do in TopNet, really the same job description if you think about it. But within USAP in a very focused way, that's a lot of what I do. And when I was on previously, we talked about enhanced recovery protocols.
Yeah.
50 or 60 of those spinning around the country in all sorts of different service lines. We have a giant library full of protocols and policies so anybody who wants to can just pick one up and put it in place. And there's a relatively easy playbook for doing that for USAP practices. Another example right now, actually, prior to COVID, our most common topic of conversation was, can we do X in an ambulatory surgery setting? And it was that interface between inpatient and outpatient care that was the hottest area in American anesthesia practice. We get financial incentives, the payers have financial incentives to move stuff to the outpatient environment. And really, we're the gatekeepers of that process. We have to decide if it's safe, how to do it right. So that was a big topic, and we continue to discuss that today. Robotic prostatectomies are the cusp today, if you're interested. Soon will be 23-hour stay or outpatient procedures in a bunch of our practices. For routine patients, otherwise healthy patients. And obviously, you try and cherry pick the surgeon and the patient so that you ease into that in the best way possible. Again, we have a playbook for all of that. So part of what I do, and one of the fun parts of the job, like it is a fun part of your job, is I talk to every manufacturer and vendor in the world about IT products, new medications, new equipment, new anything. So I have all kinds of half-hour and hour presentations where somebody's trying to sell me something. And I'm a wonderful test audience for that. I will always listen to questions because I want to know what's going on out there in the business. And then the interesting ones I bring to the quality committee, and we sort of kick it around. Sometimes somebody will have experience with it or something close already, and we'll compare that. We'll have a discussion internally. And then the good ones turn into something called a new technology alert, which is a sort of standard form we use inside USAP that I then blast out to our 4,500 clinicians. Every 2 weeks, we send out a newsletter to everybody, and a regular feature of that is clinical topics like this. So cool new stuff, I get to transmit to all of USAP, and then I will plunge in and attempt to create pilots to use it or test it or see what it really does.
So, Rick, we're all gathered here today because, like many people, we're interested and passionate about quality. And in those discussions we've had together over the decades, that always loops back to value, because whenever we have discussions about innovation, someone wants to very quickly talk about cost.
Yes.
And therefore that's inevitable. And therefore our job is to flag up cool stuff. And then we flag up cool stuff and we say we think we have an unmet need. And then it's our duty to say we think there's a value proposition here. And now the next step is, can you prove that value proposition? And I should point out, we're going to pivot off a novel antiemetic agent, and many of us would say, get out of here, surely there's nothing to talk about antiemesis. It's a novel agent which is specifically approved. It's produced by Acacia. There'll be a lot of chat about it if there isn't already, but it's specifically for rescue antiemesis. And we can get into that in a little bit more detail, but we'll do that in other conversations. But because it's new, it's going to cost. And something that's new usually costs more. And usually to get it to market, they've had to make the value proposition. How far down the journey do you have to go to get it onto the formulary, or do you have to prove the value proposition?
Right. So I'm obviously sensitive to this, and we practice very much in the real world. So this is in my conversation. Well, whoever it is trying to sell me whatever it is, I will always ask, what does it cost? Who pays? What's the value proposition? In so many words. And obviously the detailers and the marketers I talk to all have that down. So I will absorb that. One of the things the clinical quality committee will often do is a little bit of research. So we'll actually go read some of the primary articles and see if we, what that suggests to us. And then again, if I like it, if I think there is a value proposition, that's when we're sending out the technology alert and sort of informing everybody of it. And that alert includes a very specific box: who pays and how much, and what is the value proposition? How do we see this? So yes, when I got the call, hey, we want to talk to you about this new antiemetic, I'm like, we have 6 classes of antiemetic already, 4 of which are free effectively for us now. Why do we need a 7th? But I got on the phone, or the Zoom call, I listened to it, I looked through the slides, we reviewed it. As you said, Acacia with Baremsys did something relatively clever. They sought a specific rescue from postoperative nausea and vomiting. And they targeted a very specific niche to get their toes in the water. And I think this was very clever of them to say, rather than competing for prophylaxis, where, as I say, we have 4 free alternatives. And incidentally, this is one of our national quality measures. We track the administration of prophylaxis across all of our practice. Patients where we look at every patient's risk factors, and those with multiple risk factors get multiple antiemetics. It is a federal quality measure. We've been reporting it for years. We do very well at this. But most of our high-risk patients are getting dexamethasone, ondansetron during the case. If they're very high risk, maybe a scopolamine patch beforehand. And all of these are relatively cheap and well-established therapies. So very hard to get into that. And I am not going to overcome the hospital's value-based purchasing committee or P&T committee, pharmacy and therapeutics, whoever owns the bureaucracy around approving this and getting it on the formulary for a prophylactic indication in this space. That's just not going to happen. But as I said, Acacia chose to target rescue, which I think was bright because nobody was in that niche. They produced a bunch of literature, so some compelling studies that show that in a patient who has gotten the cheap prophylaxis already, if they do have nausea or vomiting in the PACU, that administration of this medication can help. And the data was relatively compelling.
So we pause there for a second, Rick, because I must admit the first time we interviewed TJ Gann about, PONV guidelines and the fact that there was a new agent coming around the corner, it was nothing about TJ. It became exciting once she explained it. It was a yawn moment, as we said, it's kind of like, really? And then it was that kind of, well, if you think about your practice, if you're involved in seeing patients post-operatively, no matter how hard you try with your risk profiling and with your multi-current agents available, as you say, that are nearly free, there's always that heart sink patient that is grey, looking really miserable. And they're not usually throwing up. They're usually nauseated. And you have a heart sink because you say, well, we're going to offer what we currently offer. And the only thing that's probably going to work is tincture of time. So yes, it got my attention when they said, by going at the pharmacology differently, dopamine 2, dopamine 3 receptors, the biology made sense, the pharmacology makes sense. It's not going to work for everyone, but you've got something to offer that can rescue. And that's where it became intriguing.
And for me too. And so we looked at this and then, okay, so now we have an interesting proposition, but being very pragmatic and having been in the business for a long time, I got to get my hands on it, right? So the professional obligation there for USAP, we want to be innovative, right? We want to continually improve care where it's possible. And to do that, we need to have access to new medications. Now, if they're very expensive, there is a value consideration there, and we can't blow the hospital's budget on something that's not proven. But very often the proof, especially for clinicians, is in actually using it. So my job then is, okay, I want to make this available to my partners, to our clinicians, so we can find out whether it works or not. And I've put some medications out there and they get ignored. And same with new equipment, right? You put it in the workroom, you have lunch, you get detailed on it, and then it just gathers dust because it's too much trouble or it doesn't seem to add value in real life, and we don't use it. But other things, glide scopes, for example, gamma decks, the first time you use it, you say, wow, this is much better. We should use this on everybody. And then it's less a discussion about whether it works, because everybody gets that it does, and more a discussion about who do we use it, how do we use it appropriately, how do we fit this into the value proposition? So how do we use this to actually improve care?
Rick, can you track the value proposition?
Sure. There's literature, and TJ developed some of it, around what a patient with PONV costs you. And it's PACU time, length of stay in the PACU, and everybody's PACU is instructed at 4:00 in the afternoon. So getting that patient out is important. It's important for patient flow. It's hugely important for patient satisfaction. And from our prior talk, USAP measures patient satisfaction quite closely. We follow this and we work on it continually. So we have data about this, and we know that PONV is a major dissatisfier. So it's something we want to work on. And so we can turn that into dollars. And part of my discussion with the P&T committee, so the first line is, we want to have access to try this. And then that's always followed by reassurance. We're happy to work with you to not break the bank, right? We don't want to give it to anybody. We'll give it in specific indications. We'll write guidelines for that. We'll follow them, but we need access to it to find out if it helps. And then the third argument in this case was, here's the value proposition. Here's what effective treatment of PONV in the PACU means to the patient. Here's what the drug costs. Here's what we get out of it. And I work in Dallas. I work clinically in the OR at Baylor University Medical Center, which is the flagship for Baylor Scott and White, which is a giant healthcare system. 50 hospitals in North Texas and a gazillion surgery centers and clinics and what all. I mean, it's a colossus. And they have all of the ablative armor of every other health system to ward off expensive new stuff. So they have a very sophisticated system-wide P&T committee. But my job is to go tackle that. And here was an example. And as a Baylor physician, I can wade right in. So we took it to the P&T committee and we took it right to the top. I called the pharmacist who chairs that, and we had a chat, and he made the mistake of telling me what we needed to do to get it approved, and then we did it. They looked at all the literature. They had some pharmacy intern write the 4-page summary of literature on this. They came back and they refused it the first time, but there was enough wiggle room in there that we were able to go back, give them a very specific algorithm, say, it boiled down to, we'll use this 5 or 6 times a month, that instead we would be prescribing EMEN and K1 inhibitor, right? Because we had clear literature that says giving another dose of ondansetron isn't going to help. But it was what most people were doing. And we pulled all that data and showed, here's what's being done. It's ineffective. It's proven ineffective. Here's what should be done. All the alternatives are expensive or dangerous. In the case of promethazine was the other one that conversation at that point, but it's sedating, it prolongs stay, it's contraindicated in some patients. And the pharmacy knew all that because they'd published all that themselves. So we were able to go back and say, compared to the other alternatives, this is a reasonable one with a reasonable value proposition. We gave them a very specific flow chart, this, then this, then this, and they bought it. And so we get access to it at the institution. And it's been 3 or 4 months now. We have given it, maybe 8 or 10 times a month. In talking to the folks who have, including myself, it works. It's helped. So this is a success. And my goal in this was not to sell 1 million units for Acacia. My goal was to give my clinicians access to a new medication that could be helpful.
Do you have to, because these are reasonably familiar processes in the National Health Service, and there's always a suggestion that they're going to follow through and make sure that you delivered the value proposition. Do you have to close out on that? Is there a follow-up report? Or if there's enough kind of, look, we're sensible practitioners. If we do it and it works when we do it, we want to keep doing it. And if we're not breaking the bank, we're not breaking the bank.
It was not overt in the process, but it was strongly implied. The hospital pharmacy is clearly looking at their budget. And if this line item sticks out, they will be back to talk to us. I have no doubt. So it didn't need to be said overtly because we know they're doing it.
We've talked about how we create a value proposition really for the hospital and our partners, and our clients that we're working with. But how do we do that for our providers? I know you said you kind of want to get it out there and get it in their hands, but there's a lot of people out there who are very adverse to new ideas, new technology, new drugs. So how do you really make the value proposition work for them?
This is on the points of light side of quality, right? This is not dealing with exceptions and adverse events and failures. This is a positive opportunity. And the fun part about positive opportunities is I don't have to force it. As I said, I have 4,500 clinicians. We're in hundreds of hospitals, hundreds and hundreds of surgery centers. I can just toss it out there. I can cast the seed and some of it will fall in fertile ground. Somebody somewhere among my 4,500 clinicians is dealing with this particular problem or is in an environment where it's right to try this out. And it's the adoption curve, right? There will be early adopters, there will be resistors, but all I'm trying to do is find the early adopters at this point. So it's a matter of communication, putting it out there. Hey, this is good. This is what the cool kids are doing. Breaking down as many of the logistic barriers as I can. So here's the protocol. Here's our algorithm. Here's how we tackled the P&T committee. Here's how we did it. And I can give you the playbook. I'm happy to go talk to your P&T folks. Make it as easy as possible for the clinician. Put the opportunity out there. And it's the early adapters I'm interested in this case.
Yeah. Do you think your providers know that PONV is still existing and it's still a major problem? Because that's one thing that, we kind of deal with sometimes, that your providers don't always know. The clinicians, once you drop them off, they may not be communicating tightly.
Yeah. And we probably don't know it as perfectly as we can. Actually, measure PONV in the recovery room is challenging. It's definitionally complex.
Yeah.
Who says, what's the definition? Who defines it? When is it defined? Because we all know that it's higher post-PACU and it's even higher on the drive home, right? And we have no idea, little idea who throws up on the way home, right? I have a few places where we actually track that because the PACU calls everybody back the next day, right? It's a requirement for outpatient surgery in the US. There has to be follow-up. And there are some places where the infrastructure is good enough and the connections are good enough that when the PACU nurse makes that phone call, that data will eventually get back to me. So we have some idea about the problem. But I think in this case, it's much more pragmatic than that. If the patient is uncomfortable in the PACU, if the PACU nurse feels like they can't discharge them, that will prompt a phone call to the anesthesiologist. Last case of the day, I get that call on my drive home. That's really irritating as all get out. So that tends to stick in the memory. And I think that probably more than anything is the problem statement.
Pain is a big motivator. Well, Rick, yeah, that's right.
Right?
Yes, absolutely. Rick, thank you so much for joining us to talk about Barensis and just this process and the value proposition for a lot of the things that we do. I think it can make a big difference. We really look forward to, hopefully we can see you in person at Anesthesiology 2021, right? ASA big meeting.
I'll be there. If you're not quarantined in Ireland, you'll be there.
That's right. That could be worse things.
A good thing. So.
We can still do everything virtually. We do know that. Yeah. Well, thank you for joining us and taking the time. We look forward to talking to you again. Thank you so much for listening and watching Top Med Talk. We appreciate all of our sponsors, but Acacia today, thank you for sponsoring this wonderful conversation. So, Monty, I believe that's a wrap.
Take care.
Yeah.
Take care.
Top Med Talk. Thanks for downloading Top Med Talk. Don't forget to subscribe via your podcatcher. Don't forget to check us out on social media. We're on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube. And also, don't forget, Top Med Talk is the broadcasting arm of EBPOM, Evidence-Based Perioperative Medicine. We'd love you to find out more about that. If you check out ebpom.org, you can find low prices on some of the conferences we're organising around the world. Many of them are virtual and don't even involve you leaving your own home. Check out ebpom.org now. This piece was supported in part through an unrestricted educational grant from Acacia Pharma Incorporated.